In August 1934, Nazi Germany made a major change. The military no longer swore loyalty to the German constitution, but instead pledged absolute obedience to Hitler himself. Even though some top army officers didn't always agree with him, they still worked with him for several reasons. He was rebuilding Germany's military, reversing the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. He also promised them a chance to fight their enemies, particularly in France and the Soviet Union. On top of that, many high-ranking generals were bribed with extra pay, land, and other rewards. When World War II began on September 1, 1939, and especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the German military actively supported the Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads responsible for mass killings. These squads murdered between 1.5 and 2 million Jewish men, women, and children across Eastern Europe. But the atrocities didn't stop there. German soldiers also took part in the killing of disabled people, Roma communities, Eastern European civilians, and prisoners of war. One such officer involved in these events was General Anton Dostler. Anton Dostler was born on May 10, 1891, in Munich, which was then part of the German Empire. At 19, he joined the Bavarian Army as a cadet in June 1910 and was promoted to lieutenant 2 years later. When World War I began on July 28, 1914, he continued to rise in the ranks. By January 1916, he had reached the rank of first lieutenant, and in October 1918, he was promoted to captain. He was awarded both classes of the Iron Cross and the Bavarian Military Merit Order for bravery and distinguished service. The war ended on November 11, 1918, when German leaders signed an armistice in Compiègne Forest, France. After the war, Germany's new government, known as the Weimar Republic, formed a much smaller army called the Reichswehr, limited to just 100,000 soldiers. Dostler continued his military career in this force, adapting to the changes in Germany's military structure in the years that followed. On October 1, 1924, Anton Dostler was transferred to the Military Intelligence Department in the Reichswehr Ministry in Berlin. At the same time, he started studying at a local university. In 1932, he was promoted to major. A year later, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power. By 1935, under Nazi racial laws, Jews were banned from joining the military, and those already serving were removed. In 1938, Hitler took full control of the German military, becoming its supreme commander. By then, the Wehrmacht had been deeply influenced by Nazi ideology, especially after Hitler gained the military's respect by annexing Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia without going to war. Many young soldiers had also joined straight from Hitler Youth and the Reich Labor Service. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, some officers were uneasy about the brutal actions carried out by Nazi forces. However, after Germany's stunning victory over France in mid-1940, most kept their concerns to themselves. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22, 1941, the German army worked closely with the Einsatzgruppen, Nazi death squads responsible for mass executions. The military provided logistical support as these squads systematically murdered between 1.5 and 2 million Jewish men, women, and children across Eastern Europe. Officers were well aware of these massacres through official reports and liaison officers, yet almost none objected to Hitler's orders in the so-called ideological war against the Soviet Union. Before the invasion, the main complaint among Wehrmacht officers was not about the mass killings, but about delays in the campaign's timeline. When Germany and its allies attacked the Soviet Union, Anton Dostler commanded the 57th Infantry Division, which was part of Army Group South. His unit took part in the assault on Kiev. Army Group South was led by Walter von Reichenau, a devoted Nazi who closely cooperated with the SS Einsatzgruppen. Under his command, the German military played a role in the massacre at Babi Yar, where tens of thousands of Jews were executed in one of the war's largest mass killings. On September 29th to 30th, 1941, Nazi forces carried out a brutal massacre in the Babi Yar ravine, just outside Kiev. Under the command of Einsatzgruppe C, SS troops, German police, and their collaborators executed tens of thousands of Jewish residents. Over the course of 2 days, 33,771 people were murdered, making it one of the deadliest single-location massacres of World War II. Most of the victims were women, children, the elderly, and those who had been too sick or unable to escape earlier. Between June and December 1942, Anton Dostler led the 163rd Infantry Division, which fought alongside Finnish forces during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. While the division initially took part in Operation Barbarossa, it spent most of the war stationed in Finland. As the situation changed, German forces retreated from Finland to Norway in the autumn of 1944. Meanwhile, Dostler's career advanced, and on January 1, 1943, he was promoted to the rank of Generalleutnant, equivalent to a major general. He then took on various temporary assignments in military command. On September 8, 1943, Italy's leader, General Pietro Badoglio, announced his country's surrender to the Allied forces. Up until that point, Italy had been a close ally of Nazi Germany. However, the Germans had already suspected that Italy might switch sides. In response, they quickly seized control of northern and central Italy, along with Italian-occupied areas in Yugoslavia, Greece, and France. Shortly after, SS paratroopers launched a daring operation to rescue Benito Mussolini from captivity, reinstalling him as the leader of the pro-Nazi Italian Social Republic, based in Salo. In January 1944, Dostler was assigned as the commander of the newly formed 75th Army Corps, which was established on January 15th in Frankfurt am Main. Later that month, on January 24th, his forces were transported through Munich and Verona to Liguria, Italy. Once there, the Corps was tasked with defending the Ligurian coastline, cracking down on resistance fighters, and fortifying strategic areas around cities like Genoa, La Spezia, and Livorno. This role continued until mid-July 1944, when the battlefront pushed northward, bringing the fight directly to Liguria. On March 22, 1944, a group of 15 American soldiers, including 2 officers, landed on the Italian coast near La Spezia as part of Operation Ginny 2. Their mission was to destroy a railway tunnel in Fremura, a crucial supply route between La Spezia and Genoa. The soldiers were dressed in full U.S. Army uniforms and carried no civilian clothing. However, just 2 days after their arrival, they were captured by a mix of Italian fascist troops and German soldiers. The captured men were taken to La Spezia and held near the headquarters of the 135th Fortress Brigade, led by German Colonel Kurt Almers. His direct superior was General Anton Dostler, commander of the 75th Army Corps. After their capture, the Americans were interrogated by German intelligence officers, and one of them disclosed the details of their mission. This information was quickly relayed to General Dostler. Unsure of what to do, Dostler reported the situation to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the highest-ranking German commander in Italy, and asked for instructions. According to Dostler's adjutant, Kesselring issued a clear order: execute the prisoners. Dostler then sent a telegram to the 135th Fortress Brigade, ordering them to carry out the execution in accordance with Hitler's 1942 Commando Order. This directive stated that any captured Allied commandos, regardless of whether they were in uniform or had surrendered, were to be executed without trial. Colonel Almers hesitated, recognizing that executing uniformed prisoners of war violated the 1929 Geneva Convention. He tried to persuade Dostler to delay the execution, but his requests were denied. Dostler sent another telegram insisting that the order be followed immediately. Almers made 2 more attempts, one even by phone, to stop the execution, but his efforts were unsuccessful. On the morning of March 26, 1944, the 15 captured American soldiers were taken to Punta Bianca, south of La Spezia, and executed by firing squad. After the execution, which was more akin to a massacre, the bodies of the 15 American soldiers were buried in a mass grave that was carefully concealed. One of Dostler's staff officers, Alexander zu Dona Schlobitten, refused to sign the execution order, unaware of Hitler's commando order. His act of defiance led to his dismissal from the Wehrmacht for insubordination. Meanwhile, General Anton Dostler continued his military service without consequence. From November 1944, he was transferred to command the 73rd Army Corps, where he remained until the end of the war. However, justice eventually caught up with him. After Germany's surrender, Dostler was captured by the United States Army. Unlike the commandos he had executed without trial, he was given a proper legal process. Once the Americans uncovered the fate of the commando unit, Dostler was charged with war crimes. His trial began on October 8, 1945, at the Royal Palace in Caserta, Italy, marking the first Allied war crimes tribunal after the war. He was accused of ordering the unlawful execution of 15 American prisoners of war. In his defense, Dostler claimed that he had merely relayed the execution order from Field Marshal Kesselring to Colonel Almers and had not made the decision himself. In 1941, the Soviet Union was caught off guard. For months, Soviet leaders ignored warnings from Western nations about German troops gathering near their borders. Then, on June 22, Germany and its Axis allies launched a massive invasion, taking the Soviets by surprise. The German forces quickly destroyed much of the Soviet Air Force while it was still on the ground, and their armies rapidly pushed forward. Millions of Soviet soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, with little choice but to surrender. As the German army moved deeper into Soviet territory, special SS and police units followed behind. Among them were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile Nazi death squads responsible for mass executions. They targeted Jews, communists, and anyone else the Nazis saw as a threat to their long-term control over the region. On September 19, 1941, German troops entered Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Soon after, a series of powerful explosions rocked the city, destroying German headquarters and killing many German officials and soldiers. The blasts were caused by mines left behind by retreating Soviet forces, but the Nazis used this as an excuse to take brutal action against the remaining Jewish population. Between September 29th and 30th, SS and German police units, along with local collaborators, carried out a mass execution at Babi Yar, a ravine just outside Kiev. In just 2 days, they murdered 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children. This massacre would go down as one of the worst atrocities of World War II, and those responsible would later face justice. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa, was one of the largest military campaigns in history. Over 3.5 million German and Axis troops took part in the attack. From the start, the Nazis had planned this as a war of total destruction, aiming to wipe out both the Soviet government, which they labeled Judeo-Bolshevik, and its people, especially the Jewish population. Before the invasion, Kiev was home to around 160,000 Jews, making up roughly 20% of the city's population. As Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, around 100,000 managed to flee or were already serving in the Soviet military. By the time German forces took control of the city, approximately 60,000 Jews remained, mostly women, children, the elderly, and those too sick or unable to escape. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the war. Between September 20th and 28th, a series of deadly explosions shook Kiev. These blasts were caused by explosives planted by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, before the city fell to the Germans. The destruction was massive. Entire sections of the city center were reduced to rubble, including the German headquarters. Many German soldiers and officials were killed. Seizing the opportunity, the Nazis used this as an excuse to take brutal revenge on the remaining Jewish population. On September 28th, German authorities ordered all Jews in Kiev to gather the following morning, claiming they were being relocated. Initially, they expected around 5,000 to 6,000 people to show up. Instead, more than 30,000 arrived, many believing the resettlement was real due to how efficiently the operation was organized. They had no idea of the fate that awaited them. The crowd was taken to a site just outside the city, a deep ravine known as Babi Yar. There, they were forced to undress and led down into the ravine. SS troops, specifically Sonderkommando 4A from Einsatzgruppe C under SS Standartenführer Paul Blobel, carried out the executions. A German truck driver named Hofer later described what he saw. He recalled how men, women, and children were marched through different stations, forced to give up their belongings, then their coats, shoes, and even their undergarments. Any hesitation was met with kicks and shoves from the guards. At the edge of the ravine, victims were made to lie on top of those who had already been shot. Then an SS officer walked through, firing a submachine gun at each person's neck, creating layers upon layers of bodies. The massacre at Babi Yar was one of the worst mass killings of the Holocaust, and its horror would be remembered as one of history's darkest moments. The executions at Babi Yar were carried out with chilling precision. Witnesses recalled seeing German marksmen standing on layers of corpses, shooting each victim one by one. The executioner would walk across the bodies of those already killed to reach the next person lying down, then fire another shot. By the evening, the Germans collapsed part of the ravine's wall, burying the dead and wounded under heavy layers of earth. Those who were still alive were buried alongside the dead. Meanwhile, the valuables, clothing, and even underwear of the victims were taken by local ethnic Germans and Nazi officials in the city. According to SS reports sent to Berlin, 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were massacred in just 2 days. Despite the horror, at least 29 people managed to survive. One of them was Dina Pronicheva, who had been forced to march to the execution site, undress, and stand at the edge of the ravine. In her post-war testimony, she described the nightmare unfolding before her eyes. Again and again, new groups of men, women, the elderly, and children were forced to strip. They were marched to the open pit, where machine gunners awaited them. Then another group was brought in. I saw it all with my own eyes. I wasn't near the pit, but I could hear the desperate cries of people and the quiet voices of children calling, "Mother, Mother." At the last moment, Pronicheva threw herself into the pit before the gunfire reached her. She landed on top of a pile of corpses and played dead. Under the cover of night, she managed to crawl out and escape. However, the killing at Babi Yar did not end with the September massacre. Over the next 2 years, the Germans used the site to execute tens of thousands more: Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma and Sinti people, patients from a psychiatric hospital, and other civilians. By the time the Nazi occupation ended, an estimated 100,000 people had been murdered at Babi Yar. In the summer of 1943, as the Soviet Red Army advanced toward Kiev, the Germans attempted to erase all evidence of their crimes. They forced around 300 prisoners from the nearby Syrets concentration camp to exhume mass graves and burn the bodies. Once the operation was nearly complete, most of these prisoners were executed to silence any witnesses. However, a few managed to escape and later testified to Soviet authorities about what had happened. While this unimaginable horror unfolded, most of the local population in Kiev remained silent, either out of fear or indifference. Babi Yar became one of the darkest symbols of Nazi brutality, a place where thousands perished, and the truth was nearly buried along with them. While many in Kiev remained indifferent to the massacre, Others were even pleased, seeing it as a way to rid the city of its Jewish population. Some actively participated in the persecution. However, amidst the horror, a few brave individuals risked their lives to help. Yente Petrovskaya and her 6-year-old son were among those who defied the deadly order to assemble for resettlement. Instead of heading to Babi Yar, they sought refuge with people they trusted: Grigory Chaplinsky, his wife Nadezhda, and their 15-year-old son Anatoly. The Chaplinskys hid them in their home for over 2 years, protecting them until the Soviet Army liberated Kiev on November 6, 1943. Even after the war, the rescued and their rescuers remained close friends. In January 1946, 15 members of the German police were put on trial in Kiev for their crimes at Babi Yar and other atrocities. The proceedings, known as the Kiev Nuremberg, took place between January 17th and 28th, with the accused being German and Austrian officers responsible for mass executions, torture, and war crimes in the region. One of the key witnesses was Dina Pronicheva, who had miraculously survived the massacre. On January 24th, she stood before the Soviet court, her testimony captured on film for a newsreel. She described the nightmare at Babi Yar. Victims were forced to undress while the Germans beat them and set dogs on them. Some begged for mercy while others, silent, removed their clothes and walked toward the ditch. Some lost their minds. The Germans marched them in single file through an opening in the earthen wall, where I heard the rattle of machine guns. Based on Pronicheva's testimony and other evidence, the Soviet court sentenced 12 of the 15 defendants to death. Among them was Paul Scheer, a lieutenant general of police who oversaw mass executions in the Kiev and Poltava regions. Under his command, villages were burned and civilians were slaughtered. Another high-ranking officer sentenced to death was SS Obersturmbannführer Georg Heinisch, the former district commissar of Melitopol. In October 1942, he ordered the execution of 3,000 children and was responsible for the deaths of 14,000 civilians during the occupation. Heinisch also orchestrated the deportation of 1,100 people to Germany and forced schoolchildren into hard labor. Karl Burkhardt, another lieutenant general of police, used anti-partisan operations as an excuse to massacre Soviet civilians. Meanwhile, Hans Eisenmann, a member of the SS Viking Division, was found guilty of mass executions in the Lviv region. The Kiev Nuremberg Trials ensured that at least some of the perpetrators of Babi Yar faced justice, though nothing could undo the horror of what had taken place. During the trial, Hans Eisenmann openly admitted to his role in the mass executions. He stated, "Our unit conducted 4 roundups in Lviv within 2 days. As a result, up to 800 Jewish people, men, women, the elderly, and children, were taken east of Lviv and shot." He personally executed around 120 people. The other defendants sentenced to death included Fritz Beckenhoff, Wilhelm Hellerforth, Emil Jogschat, Emil Knoll, Willy Meyer, Eckhard Hans von Chammer und Osten, Georg Truckenbrot, and Oskar Walliser. The Soviet Military Tribunal of the Kiev Military District condemned these 12 men to death by hanging. 3 others received prison sentences. 2 were sentenced to 15 years, while 1 was given 20 years of hard labor. The execution took place in Kiev's Kalinin Square on January 29, 1946. It was a chilling spectacle, witnessed by a massive crowd of 200,000 people. Today, the site is known as Independence Square. These men, responsible for the deaths of over 100,000 innocent civilians, were brought in on 6 trucks. Soviet officials secured the nooses as thousands watched in grim anticipation. On each truck stood 2 condemned men, their fate sealed. Before the execution, an official addressed the crowd, concluding with the chilling command, "Comrade Commandant, enforce the sentence." With that, the trucks pulled forward, leaving the men suspended in the air. But something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Colonel Georg Truckenbrod's rope snapped. Historically, such an incident meant the condemned would be spared, but mercy was not an option that day. A new rope was brought, and Truckenbrod was hanged again. The crowd erupted in cheers. Many among them were disabled war victims who had suffered under Nazi rule. Using their crutches, they struck the lifeless bodies of the hanged men in a final act of vengeance. The corpses remained hanging until evening before being taken away for burial at a designated site. This mass hanging was the last public execution in the history of Kiev. Though these 12 men paid for their crimes, countless others who participated in the Babi Yar massacre and other atrocities were never brought to justice. The pain and suffering of the victims could never be undone, but their memory lives on. April 6, 1941. The skies over Belgrade darken as hundreds of Luftwaffe fighter planes drop bombs, marking the start of Nazi Germany's invasion of Yugoslavia. Under the codename Operation Retribution, German forces, along with Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops, sweep through the country, taking full control in just 11 days. Even before the Yugoslav army surrenders, something sinister is already unfolding. On April 10, 1941, the Germans and Italians back the creation of the so-called independent state of Croatia. This new regime is led by the Ustasha, a radical nationalist and fascist group. Once in power, they waste no time setting up concentration camps across Croatia. Their targets: Jews, Serbs, Roma, and anyone who opposes their rule, politically or religiously. The most notorious of these camps is Jasenovac, the third largest concentration camp in Europe. It becomes infamous for its brutal methods and high death toll. Within Jasenovac, there's a special detention site called Stara Gradiška, specifically built for women and children, many of them Serb, Jewish, or Romani. The man overseeing the atrocities committed against these children is none other than Ante Verban. Born on January 15, 1908, in the village of Pejakusha, near Gospic, modern-day Croatia, Verban grew up in what was then Austria-Hungary. After the empire collapsed, Gospic became part of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later renamed the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929 by King Alexander I. Meanwhile, World War II had already begun. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, sparking a global conflict. Before Hitler's rise to power, anti-Semitism wasn't widespread in Yugoslavia, but as Nazi Germany intensified its persecution of Jews, anti-Semitic attitudes started growing there too. By October 1940, the Yugoslav government, hoping to stay on Germany's good side, introduced two anti-Jewish laws, one limiting Jewish student admissions in schools and universities, and another restricting what food items Jews could buy or sell. Many Serbian intellectuals and citizens protested these laws, but their efforts made no difference. On April 10, 1941, just 4 days after Nazi Germany invaded Yugoslavia, the Germans and Italians backed the creation of the so-called independent state of Croatia. This new fascist regime was led by the extremist Ustasha organization, known for its brutal and terrorist tactics. Before the war, Ante Verban was just a trading assistant, but after Croatia was formed, he eagerly joined the Ustasha militia. The group had deep hatred for Serbs, Jews, communists, and anyone who wasn't Catholic. Under their rule, hundreds of thousands of Serbs were either killed or forced out of their homes. In rural areas, Ustasha fighters and Croatian military units burned entire Serbian villages to the ground, slaughtering men and subjecting women to horrific abuse. Between 1941 and 1942, Croat authorities were responsible for the deaths of an estimated 320,000 to 340,000 ethnic Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. By May 1941, the Ustasha established the Jadovno concentration camp in the Lika region of Croatia. Thousands of Serbs and other prisoners were sent there. most never made it out alive. On July 27, 1941, resistance erupted in the village of Srb as locals, unable to endure the relentless persecution, rose up against the Ustasha. This rebellion was led by two groups: the Chetniks, Serbian royalist fighters seeking to restore the monarchy, and the Yugoslav partisans, communist-led resistance forces fighting against the Axis powers. The revolt quickly spread across the Lika and Bosanska Krajina regions. But when the Germans stepped in to crush the uprising, they did so with extreme brutality, leaving behind mass destruction and countless deaths. During this time, Ante Verban played a direct role in the massacre of Serbs in Lika and the mass killings of Jews in Jadovno. The Jadovno camp, hidden deep in the Velebit Mountains at an altitude of 1,250 meters, sat about 22 kilometers northwest of Gospic. Prisoners there were usually executed by being thrown into deep ravines near the camp. Though it only operated for 3 months, the number of victims killed at Jadovno is estimated to be anywhere between 10,000 and 68,000, with most of them being Serbs. One of the most horrifying execution sites was a deep pit located about 5 kilometers, 3.1 miles, from the camp. Victims, tied together in long lines, were led to the pit's edge by Ustasha guards. One by one, they were pushed in, falling to their deaths in the darkness below. At the start of each execution, the first prisoners in line were killed using brutal methods: hacked with axes, struck with mallets or rifle butts, or shot. Their bodies were then pushed into the pit, and as they fell, they pulled down others who were still alive, sometimes dragging entire lines of up to 100 people into the abyss. Once inside, grenades were often thrown in to finish off anyone still breathing. In some cases, dogs were tossed into the pit, left to feast on the wounded and the dead. No one was spared, not even infants. The youngest recorded victim of Jadovno was just 6 months old. Both Serbian and Croatian witnesses later testified that after filling the pits with bodies, Ustasha forces covered them with concrete, dirt, and leaves to erase any trace of their crimes. On August 21, 1941, Jadovno was shut down. The remaining Croatian prisoners were transferred to other Ustasha-run camps, while the Serbs and Jews who were still alive were executed. That same month, the construction of Jasenovac concentration camp began. Eventually, the area where Jadovno once stood was handed over to Italian forces. For a short time, Ante Verban was put in charge of Slana concentration camp, located on Pag Island. Even among the horrors of Ustasha camps, Slana stood out for its extreme brutality. A local Catholic priest, Don Joso Felicinovic, who initially helped establish Ustasha control on the island, later wrote that Slana became a miniature Auschwitz-Dachau, a place where innocent men, women, and children were slaughtered in unspeakable ways. When he visited the abandoned camp, Felicinovic discovered a horrifying record: a piece of cardboard nailed to the wall of the main Ustasha barracks, listing the names of women and girls who had been raped, along with the dates and the names of their attackers. On November 13, 1941, Verban, already experienced in mass murder from Jadovno and Slana, arrived at Stara Gradiška with a group of arrested Freemasons. Stara Gradiška was one of 5 detention facilities within the Jasenovac concentration camp complex, which had been built between August 1941 and February 1942. There, Verban was appointed deputy commandant, serving under Mile Orešković. Stara Gradiška, a subcamp of the Jasenovac concentration camp, was specifically designed for women and children from Serb, Jewish, and Romani backgrounds. It also housed anti-fascist Croats and Bosniaks, many of whom were targeted for their political beliefs. One of the most feared figures in the camp was Ante Verban, known for his extreme cruelty. He actively participated in mass executions, but what made him particularly notorious was his brutal treatment of children. After the war, survivor Tsiordana Friedlander recalled a horrifying moment. Every day, new women and children arrived at Stara Gradiška. A few weeks later, Verban ordered all children to be separated from their mothers and locked in a room. 10 of us were forced to take them there. One little boy stuck his arm and leg through the doorway, stopping the door from closing. Verban screamed, "Push!" When I hesitated, he slammed the door shut, breaking the child's leg. Then he grabbed him by the leg and smashed him against the wall until he was lifeless. After that, we continued bringing in the children. Once the room was packed, Verban sealed it and filled it with poison gas. Another survivor, Lidija Zlatic, recalled the suffering of Serbian civilians in the summer of 1942. She described how entire families from Kozara villages were brought in. Healthy men and women were sent to work in Germany and Norway, while the elderly and children were left behind, many disappearing without a trace. The children's camp was filled with disease and starvation. Typhus, dysentery, and scarlet fever ran rampant. The person overseeing this nightmare was Ante Verban, aided by a prisoner named Olga. Verban later admitted to personally poisoning 63 sick children with Zyklon B, estimating their ages to be between 2 and 12 years old. In 1942, when a typhus outbreak spread through the camp, Verban threatened to blow up the entire facility if the disease was confirmed. To protect the sick women, supervisors hid them in toilets, attics, and work areas to keep them from being discovered. As the outbreak worsened, doctors reassured Verban that it was only a severe flu, which they secretly referred to as the city flu. Later that year, Verban was transferred from Jasenovac. His assistant Olga was executed by fellow Ustasha members, likely to silence her as she had witnessed countless atrocities. In the final years of the war, Verban fought in military operations against Chetnik forces, including the Battle of Lijevce Field in the spring of 1945. The Croatian forces emerged victorious, leading to the deaths of several hundred Chetniks and the capture of around 5,500 soldiers, weakening the movement in the region. However, as World War II ended in May 1945, the independent state of Croatia collapsed. Josip Broz Tito's partisans took control, leading to the formation of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, with Croatia as one of its republics. As for Ante Verban, he initially fled to Austria, but in 1947, he and another Ustasha officer, Ljubo Miloš, illegally crossed the Yugoslav-Hungarian border to launch an anti-communist guerrilla movement known as the Križari, or Crusaders. However, their plan failed. By summer 1947, the group was captured in the Papuk Mountains. Verban was put on trial before the Supreme Court of the National Republic of Croatia in Zagreb during the summer of 1948. He admitted to his role in mass murders and was sentenced to death by hanging. On August 31, 1948, at the age of 40, Ante Verban was executed in Zagreb. There was no mourning for the man who had committed such unspeakable crimes. In September 1938, Germany's leader, Adolf Hitler, threatened to start a war in Europe if Czechoslovakia didn't give up the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. To avoid conflict, the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met in Munich on September 29th to 30th and agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. However, Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the meeting. Less than 6 months later, on March 15, 1939, Hitler broke the agreement and sent Nazi forces to occupy Bohemia and Moravia, 2 key regions of Czechoslovakia. The next day, from Prague Castle, he officially declared them part of Nazi-controlled territory, known as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Over 118,000 Jewish people in the area suddenly found themselves under Nazi rule, including a young girl named Edith Polachova. Edith was born on July 12, 1929, in Prague. She was the only child of Elizabeth and Hanusz Polak, who affectionately called her Dita. The family, fluent in both German and Czech, lived in a rented apartment in Prague with their maid. Dita's mother was a homemaker, while her father worked as a lawyer for the State Pension Institute, often traveling across Czechoslovakia to represent workers in court. Her grandfather, Johann Polak, was active in politics and even served as a senator in the Czechoslovak National Parliament as a member of the Social Democratic Party. Despite the growing tensions in Europe, Dita had a happy childhood. She loved school, playing with friends, and taking walks in the park. On January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg, Dita was just 3 years old. Soon after, the Nazi regime began stripping Jewish people of their rights. In March 1933, less than 2 months later, the first concentration camp, Dachau, was established. As persecution worsened, thousands of Jews fled Germany, including some of Dita's parents' friends who arrived in Prague and warned them about what was happening. Until then, Dita didn't even know she was Jewish. Her family wasn't religious, so being Jewish wasn't a part of her daily life. But she noticed how worried her parents became. She often overheard them discussing things like Nazism, Adolf Hitler, and the Nuremberg laws, which laid the foundation for Germany's anti-Jewish policies. Things took a turn for the worse in late summer 1938 when Hitler annexed the Sudetenland, a region in Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. This area also contained the country's military defenses in case of war with Germany. Seeing this, Dita's parents started considering emigration, fearing that Hitler wouldn't stop with just the Sudetenland. But leaving was difficult. Most countries were not accepting Jewish refugees. Their fears became reality on March 15, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, turning it into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Unlike the Sudetenland, this region was mostly Czech. As soon as the Nazis took control, they introduced harsh anti-Jewish laws. Jewish people were removed from society, their bank accounts were frozen, and they were banned from selling businesses or property, most of which was seized by the Germans. In total, about $500 million worth of Jewish assets were confiscated in the Protectorate. The Polak family wasn't spared. One day, 2 German officers came to their apartment in Prague and ordered them to leave. Then, Dita's father lost his job. Like many Jewish professionals, including teachers, doctors, and army officers who were dismissed from government positions. Dita's own life changed drastically. Suddenly, Jews were banned from entering certain streets, parks, and public places. The carefree childhood she once knew was gone. After World War II started on September 1, 1939, new restrictions made life even harder for Jewish people. They were no longer allowed to be outside after 8 p.m. Then, in August 1940, Jewish children were banned from attending both public and private schools. Determined to keep their children educated, Jewish parents organized secret study groups with small groups of 5 to 7 kids learning from a Jewish teacher in hiding. Since being forced out of their home, the Polak family had to share a cramped 2-room apartment with another family, living in just one room. By November 1940, more oppressive laws were introduced. Jews couldn't leave their town without special permission and were banned from libraries, theaters, cinemas, cafes, swimming pools, and sports facilities. Their radios were confiscated, and they weren't even allowed to own pets. Even daily tasks like shopping became difficult. Jewish people were only allowed to buy food during restricted hours, first 4 hours a day, then later reduced to just 2. On public transport, they were forced to stand in the last carriage. Despite all this, there was one place where Jewish children in Prague could still find joy: Hagabor. This playground had tennis and volleyball courts, a running track, and games organized by Friedi Hirsch, a German Jewish athlete and teacher. But because Jews were banned from using public transport, Dita had to walk an hour just to get there and back. Then, in October 1941, the Nazis began systematically deporting Jews from the Protectorate. The first transport sent them to the Lodz ghetto in German-occupied Poland. By November 3rd, 5,000 Jews had been taken away, including Dita's beloved uncle Ludwig. Not long after, the family received a card notifying them of his death. Out of the 5,000 deported, only 277 survived. Dita's Aunt Mania, who wasn't Jewish, refused to follow the Nazi law that banned non-Jews from helping Jews. She continued to support Dita and her parents, secretly bringing them food and other essentials. In November 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main figures behind the Holocaust, established the Theresienstadt ghetto in the fortress town of Terezin. That same month, the first group of Czech Jews was sent there. At the time, Dita's father worked as a clerk at the Jewish Community Center. Another department in the center, under Nazi orders, was responsible for making lists of people to be deported. Because of his job, Dita's family was able to delay their deportation for a few months. However, in July 1942, her grandparents were sent to Theresienstadt, and in November, Dita and her parents were taken there as well. The Nazis had stripped them of almost everything, so when they arrived, they only had a few clothes, a blanket, a pillow, metal dishes, and some non-perishable food. The ghetto was so overcrowded that they had to sleep on the floor inside the fortress walls. That's where Dita's grandmother found them, bringing heartbreaking news. Her grandfather, Johann Polak, had passed away just 3 weeks earlier. Living conditions in the camp were terrible. There was barely any water or electricity, extreme overcrowding, and infestations of bed bugs, fleas, and lice. Privacy didn't exist. Food was distributed from central kitchens, but it was barely enough to survive. Meals consisted of watery soup made from lentil powder, a few potatoes or a dumpling, but never any fresh fruits or vegetables. Each person received a quarter loaf of bread for 2 days and a small spoon of jam. Hunger and disease spread quickly, and around 200 people were dying every day. Men and women were separated into different barracks, sleeping in 3-tiered wooden bunks. There were also designated living spaces for boys and girls. These rooms had only basic furniture, a table, a bench, and rows of bunks. Life in the ghetto was a constant struggle for survival. Prisoners spent their days either working, waiting in long lines for food, or lying on their bunks. Every person between the ages of 14 and 60, or 65, was required to work. Most were forced into war-related labor for Germany or assigned to the vegetable gardens. However, the food they grew never reached the prisoners. It was reserved for Nazi personnel. Dita was among those who worked in the gardens. Elderly prisoners who couldn't work were given 60% less food than laborers. As a result, 92% of deaths in Theresienstadt were among those over 60. Many who weren't deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz perished due to starvation and disease. While younger prisoners avoided outright starvation, they suffered from malnutrition, losing weight, and frequently falling ill. The ghetto was officially managed by Jewish elders, one of whom was Friedi Hirsch, head of the Children and Youth Department. Determined to protect the children from the horrors of the ghetto, he worked to keep them from becoming completely demoralized. He arranged for them to live in designated homes, or heims, where conditions were slightly better. Although education was strictly forbidden, former professors, scientists, and artists among the prisoners secretly continued teaching the children. Initially, Theresienstadt held mostly Czech Jews, but in June 1942, the first groups of German and Austrian Jews arrived. Later, in early 1943, Dutch and Danish Jews were also sent to the ghetto. The Nazi deportations to extermination camps soon began. On October 26, 1942, just 2 days after the last transport from Theresienstadt to Treblinka, the SS sent the first transport to Auschwitz. A total of 1,866 prisoners were crammed into the train. Upon arrival, SS officers selected 247 people, mostly men, to be registered as prisoners. The remaining 1,619 were sent directly to the gas chambers. To deceive the German public, the Nazis transported Jews from the German Reich in passenger trains, creating the illusion that they were being resettled rather than sent to their deaths. Jews deported to the German-occupied East faced even more horrific conditions. The German authorities rarely provided food or water, even on long journeys. Trains carrying deportees were often forced to wait for days on railroad sidings, with victims crammed into sealed cattle cars. They suffered extreme heat in the summer and freezing cold in the winter, all while enduring unbearable overcrowding. In December 1943, the Polak family was selected for deportation to what they were told was a labor camp in the east. The transport was packed beyond capacity. Men, women, children, and the elderly had to stand for nearly 2 days until they reached their destination, Auschwitz. Inside the cattle cars, there was no room to sit, and only a single bucket served as a toilet, quickly overflowing. The stench of urine and excrement only added to their suffering and humiliation. With no food, water, or fresh air, many deportees perished before the train even arrived. Armed guards stood watch throughout the journey under orders to shoot anyone who tried to escape. When they finally reached Auschwitz, they had no idea that their nightmare was only just beginning. In September 1938, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, threatened to start a war in Europe if Czechoslovakia didn't give up the Sudetenland, a region along its border where many ethnic Germans lived. To avoid conflict, the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met in Munich on September 29th to 30th, 1938. They agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. However, Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the meeting. Less than 6 months later, on March 15, 1939, Hitler broke the agreement and invaded the Czech regions of Bohemia and Moravia. The next day, from Prague Castle, he declared these areas as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. More than 118,000 Jews living there now found themselves under Nazi control, including a young girl named Dita Polachova. Dita and her parents endured years under Nazi occupation before being sent to the Theresienstadt ghetto. Then, in December 1943, they were deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Between October 26, 1942, and October 28, 1944, the Nazis transported nearly 47,000 Jews from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in 27 separate trains. Life in Theresienstadt, though harsh, still held some value, but in Auschwitz, survival meant nothing. When Dita's transport arrived at the camp at night, she and the others were blinded by powerful floodlights. Exhausted and confused, they were met by SS guards with snarling dogs and prisoners in striped uniforms who beat them with sticks. As soon as they arrived, the prisoners were forced to leave all their belongings behind and line up, men and boys in one group, women and girls in another. They were marched into a wooden shack where they spent the night sitting on the freezing hard floor. The next morning, Dita, her mother, and the other women were ordered to undress and take an ice-cold shower. Soaking wet, they were then forced to run barefoot through the snow to another barracks, where they were given tattered civilian clothes and worn-out shoes instead of the striped uniforms worn by most Auschwitz prisoners. Fortunately, Dita had kept her boots on during the shower, which saved them from being taken away. After that, all the prisoners were tattooed on their left arms. From that moment on, Dita was no longer called by her name. She was just a number, 73,305. She and the others were placed in the B2 Bay Camp, known as the Theresienstadt Family Camp in Auschwitz. This section was created on September 8, 1943, specifically for Jews deported from the Theresienstadt ghetto. Around 18,000 people were sent there between 1943 and 1944. It was one of 9 sub-camps in Auschwitz-Birkenau and was the second after the Gypsy family camp, where men were allowed to stay with their families, though they still slept in separate barracks. The Nazis set up this camp for propaganda purposes, but the conditions were just as brutal as in the rest of Auschwitz. Prisoners suffered from extreme hunger, harsh beatings, grueling forced labor, and barely any access to water. The camp itself consisted of 32 wooden barracks, originally built as horse stables. They had no windows, just a few small openings in the walls that barely let in any air. Each barrack in the camp held around 300 prisoners. The camp had a single washroom barrack with a row of taps that barely dripped cold, murky brown water. There was also a latrine, a long concrete row with holes divided into two sections by a strip of sackcloth. One side was for men, the other for women. But the sackcloth only covered the middle of a person's body, leaving their face and lower half exposed, adding to the humiliation. When Dita arrived, she saw prisoners who had been deported from Theresienstadt 3 months earlier. They looked different, pale, almost gray, and lifeless. No one smiled. They spoke in hushed, eerie tones, repeating strange things about gas chambers and chimneys where they would all end up. When they pointed to the chimneys, where flames flickered at night and gray ash floated in the air like snow, the new arrivals didn't understand. But in time, Dita learned the horrifying truth. The ash and the smell came from the crematoria, where the bodies of those murdered in the gas chambers were burned. Roll calls took place every morning and evening. If the numbers didn't match, the process dragged on for hours, forcing prisoners to stand still in freezing cold or scorching heat. Food was scarce. Each day, prisoners received only a bowl of watery soup at midday, and in the evening, a piece of bread with a spoonful of margarine or fake jam. Hunger consumed them. Eating was all they could think about. One day in February, during roll call, Dita realized her father wasn't there. Later that night, she sneaked into the men's barracks and found him lying on his bunk, eyes closed. When she saw that he hadn't touched his soup, she knew his time was near. That night, he passed away. Dita's mother didn't know about her husband's death right away. She was sick and confined to the hospital for infectious diseases, and Dita wasn't allowed to visit. Instead, she had to pass the heartbreaking news through a small gap in the wooden wall. Despite their grief, both were relieved that he had passed away naturally rather than being sent to the gas chambers. One of the few privileges in the Theresienstadt family camp was the children's block, located in Barrack 31. During the day, children were allowed to stay there until the afternoon roll call. The barrack was empty except for small stools, where the children sat in groups with an adult who guided them. They played games, sang songs, and even received secret lessons, though only through spoken word. There were no toys, pencils, or paper. The only real resources were a small collection of 12 to 14 books, secretly smuggled in by prisoners working in the luggage sorting area. Dita was in charge of these books, earning her the title of the camp's librarian. The head of the children's block was Freddie Hirsch, whom Dita had known from Prague and Theresienstadt. He managed to convince the camp authorities to allow the block, arguing that it would keep the children occupied while their parents were forced to work. He also secured extra food for them, arranged for their barrack to be heated, and even ensured their roll calls were conducted indoors. Hirsch was strict about hygiene, insisting that the children wash daily, even in the freezing winter of 1943 to 44. He also conducted regular lice inspections. Because of his efforts, the death rate among the children remained almost zero, while the overall mortality rate in the family camp reached 25% in just 6 months. In February 1944, the Auschwitz resistance movement uncovered the meaning behind the coded term SB6. It stood for Special Treatment 6, which meant execution in the gas chambers after 6 months. Realizing what was coming, the prisoners decided to fight back. They planned an uprising to set fire to the camp, break through the gates, and run for their lives. Freddie Hirsch was chosen as one of the leaders of the planned uprising. But on March 8, 1944, just an hour before it was supposed to start, he asked the doctors for a tranquilizer because he was feeling extremely anxious. Instead of a small dose, they gave him an overdose on purpose. The doctors had been promised by Josef Mengele that they wouldn't be killed along with the rest of the Theresienstadt family camp, as long as their skills were still useful to the SS. Because of the overdose, Hirsch fell into a deep sleep and never gave the signal to begin the uprising. Later that same day, still unconscious, he and 3,800 other men, women, and children from the September transport were loaded onto trucks and taken straight to the gas chambers where they were killed. After the September transport was wiped out, the children's block continued operating under a new leader. But Dita, who had arrived at Auschwitz in December 1943, knew that her 6 months were nearly up. By June 1944, it would be her turn. Then, in May, new orders came from Germany. They needed prisoners who were still fit to work in the German weapons industry. A selection process began, led by the infamous Auschwitz doctor Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. Men aged 16 to 45 and women aged 16 to 40 were told to report. Each had to strip, stand straight, and state just 3 things: their tattoo number, their age, and their profession. Dita was only 14, but she knew that if she told the truth, she would be sent to the gas chamber. So, when it was her turn, she confidently said she was 16 and that her profession was a painter. Mengele looked at her and asked, "A house painter or a portrait painter?" Without hesitation, Dita answered, "A portrait painter." Mengele looked at Dita and asked, "Can you paint my portrait?" Without hesitation, she answered, "Jawohl, yes." With a wave of his hand, Mengele sent her to the group assigned for hard labor. But her mother wasn't as lucky. She had been sent to the other group. Refusing to be separated from her daughter, she managed to sneak back into the line, blending in with the other frail women. Against all odds, she passed the selection, and Dita and her mother remained together. By July 1944, the Theresienstadt family camp was completely liquidated. The remaining 7,000 men, women, and children, including infants, were murdered in the gas chambers. Of those who survived the selection, about 2,000 women and 1,000 men were sent to other concentration camps in Germany. Dita and her mother were among those transported to Neuengamme, a network of sub-camps near Hamburg. As the war neared its end, the death toll in Neuengamme skyrocketed. In the winter of 1944–45, nearly 1,700 prisoners died each month. By February 1945, the number rose to 2,500. Prisoners faced not only starvation and disease, but also frequent air raids. Almost every night the skies lit up with bombing raids, forcing prisoners to take shelter in rat-infested basements. Their daily routine was grueling, waking at 5 a.m., standing in formation for roll call, and then marching to perform back-breaking labor. They were forced to clear rubble from bombed-out houses, dig trenches, or shovel snow from the streets. Despite their own suffering, some German civilians secretly left food for the starving prisoners, small acts of humanity in the midst of horror. By March 1945, the SS began emptying the Neuengamme subcamps. Dita and her mother were among the prisoners transported to Bergen-Belsen, a camp infamous for its horrific conditions. Upon arrival, they were met with a nightmare. There was no running water, barely any food, and extreme overcrowding. Thousands of prisoners were arriving on death marches from other camps. Many were already dead when the transports reached the camp, and those too weak to walk had to be hauled in by truck. In one instance, out of 1,900 prisoners on a transport, over 500 arrived dead. At Bergen-Belsen, survival became almost impossible. The prisoners received no food, and the freezing winter made things worse. The overcrowding was unbearable. In the summer of 1944, during World War II, Allied bombers launched massive air raids on German cities, killing thousands of civilians. These attacks left entire cities in ruins and fueled deep resentment among the German people, especially toward the British and Americans. On August 26, 1944, just one day after a particularly destructive bombing raid, a group of furious residents in Rüsselsheim took matters into their own hands. Armed with sticks, rocks, and shovels, they attacked 6 captured American airmen, beating them to death. The main person responsible for this brutal act was Josef Hartgen, who later faced the ultimate punishment for his crime. Josef Hartgen was born in 1904 in Rüsselsheim, which was then part of the German Empire. He worked at the Opel Company from 1928, a time when Opel dominated the German car market with a 37.5% share and was the country's top automobile exporter. In March 1929, the American corporation General Motors saw potential in Opel's advanced production system and bought 80% of the company for $33.3 million, worth over $800 million today. By 1931, General Motors had taken full control of Opel, making it entirely American-owned. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, his government immediately started preparing for war. His goal was to expand German territory, what he called Lebensraum, or living space, by conquering Poland and the Soviet Union. This plan shaped Nazi foreign policy, which focused on removing the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, bringing ethnic German regions into the Reich, taking over Eastern Europe, forming alliances, and, after war broke out on September 1, 1939, convincing other countries to join the plan to exterminate all European Jews, known as the Final Solution. Josef Hartgen worked as a foreman at Opel, a company that stopped making cars in October 1940. This happened after its American leadership refused to switch to making weapons. By 1942, Opel was producing war materials, including aircraft parts and tanks. By 1944, the Allies had gained control of the skies. American fighter planes had nearly wiped out the German Luftwaffe, making it harder for Germany to defend itself. The Allied bombing campaign aimed to destroy Germany's weapons factories, disrupt transport routes, and cut off crucial supplies like oil, steel, and coal. On August 24, 1944, an American B-24 bomber with the unusual nickname Wham! Bam! took off from England. Piloted by Second Lieutenant Norman Rogers, Jr., the plane was part of a massive air raid involving over 2,000 aircraft. Their target was an airfield near Hanover. As they approached, they came under heavy anti-aircraft fire. Just after dropping their bombs, the plane was hit multiple times, suffering serious damage. A direct hit in the bomb bay wrecked the hydraulic system, disabled one engine, and left 2 others barely working. With the aircraft critically damaged, the crew had no choice but to bail out. All 9 crew members parachuted into farmland below. One of the crew members, Forrest Brinnenstuhl, was badly injured in the stomach while parachuting down. After landing, an elderly farming couple found him and gave him first aid. Within hours, most of the crew were captured by the Luftwaffe and taken in for questioning. That night, they were held at a nearby air base. Thanks to their pilot, Lieutenant Norman Rogers, insisting on medical care, Brinnenstuhl was taken to a doctor, who performed surgery on his wound before transferring him to a hospital for further treatment. The next morning, while Brinnenstuhl stayed behind in the hospital, the rest of the crew were put on a train heading to a prisoner of war camp near Frankfurt. As the train passed through German towns, furious locals gathered outside, shouting insults, shaking their fists, and spitting at the captured airmen, calling them terror flyers. During the journey, the train was forced to stop near Rüsselsheim, about 25 kilometers west of Frankfurt, because the tracks had been destroyed by bombing. The guards ordered the prisoners off and began marching them on foot, expecting to find another train beyond the damaged area. As they walked closer to the town, they saw the devastation left behind by a massive bombing raid just hours earlier. On the night of August 25, 1944, the British Royal Air Force had launched a heavy attack on Rüsselsheim, aiming to destroy the Opel factory, which was producing aircraft parts for the war. The British dropped about 675 metric tons of bombs and over 400,000 incendiary devices. The factory was reduced to rubble, and large parts of the town, including its historic center, were destroyed. The fires were so intense that pilots flying more than 160 kilometers away could still see the flames. Nearly half of Rüsselsheim's homes were wiped out. Out of the 198 people who died that day, all but 12 were forced laborers working at the Opel factory. Josef Hartgen, who was also an air raid warden, organized residents to help put out the fires that were consuming their homes. As the 8 captured American airmen were forced to march through Rüsselsheim, the city was still burning. Smoke filled the air, carrying the scent of destruction and death. The townspeople, grieving their losses, were overwhelmed by anger and sorrow. When the airmen came into view, 2 German women, Margaret Witzler and Käthe Reinhardt, began shouting, "There are the terror flyers. They were here last night. They destroyed our homes. Tear them apart. Beat them to death. Kill them. We cannot show them mercy." One of the American crew members who spoke German desperately responded, "It wasn't us. We didn't bomb Rüsselsheim." But the mob didn't listen. A woman hurled a brick at them, striking Lieutenant Norman Rogers on the left side of his head, cracking his skull. This set off a violent riot. The enraged crowd attacked the prisoners with anything they could find: rocks, hammers, sticks, and shovels. The German guards, who were supposed to protect the prisoners, stood by and did nothing. Things took an even darker turn when Josef Hartgen joined in. Holding a pistol, he became the most brutal attacker. First, he grabbed a stick, similar to a hoe handle, and beat the airmen mercilessly. One was so badly injured that his right shoulder and upper chest were crushed, and a piece of stone was lodged in his skull. Once the men were barely conscious, Hartgen dragged their bodies to the side of the road, lining them up. Furious, he yelled that he would put them out of their misery. Walking along the row of beaten men, he shot 6 of them in the head. But when he ran out of bullets, 2, William Adams and Sidney Brown, were left alive. The townspeople then loaded the battered airmen onto a cart and took them to the cemetery. But when they arrived, some of the men were still groaning, struggling to move. This only fueled the mob's rage further. Those who showed signs of life were beaten again with wooden clubs. Before they could finish their brutal attack, an air raid siren suddenly blared. Panic set in, and the mob scattered, leaving the cart behind. It was later rumored that some of the men had been buried alive. Amidst the chaos, Adams and Brown, the 2 who hadn't been shot, managed to crawl away from the blood-soaked cart. They escaped toward the Rhine River, avoiding capture for 4 days. Unfortunately, Adams and Brown were eventually discovered by a policeman. They were captured and taken to their original destination, the German prisoner of war transit camp for captured airmen in Ober-Ursel. They remained there until the war in Europe came to an end. After Germany's surrender, Rüsselsheim fell under the control of the U.S. Third Army. When reports of the killing surfaced, an investigation was launched, and on June 28, 1945, the bodies of the murdered airmen were located. To the shock of the Americans, the victims were not British pilots, as previously believed, but U.S. airmen. 11 residents of Rüsselsheim were arrested, including Josef Hartgen, the leader of the attack. While in jail, Hartgen attempted to take his own life by slashing his wrist on the metal springs of his mattress. However, he was rushed to the hospital, treated, and then returned to his cell to await trial. The trial took place in late July 1945, with 11 defendants facing justice. The defense argued that Nazi propaganda had influenced the townspeople, convincing them that American airmen were war criminals who deserved punishment. However, the prosecution, led by Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, who would later become famous as the special prosecutor in the Watergate scandal, rejected this excuse. He emphasized that every individual was responsible for their own actions, stating, "They were all grown men and women. If they are called on to commit murder, and they do, they are just as responsible as any other murderers." The trial lasted 6 days. featuring harrowing eyewitness accounts of the brutal attack. Testimonies painted Hartgen as particularly vicious in his treatment of the defenseless airmen. On August 2, 1945, the court found Hartgen and 6 others guilty, sentencing them to death. Among those convicted were Margarete Witzler and Käthe Reinhardt, the 2 women who had incited the mob by shouting at the airmen. However, after emotional appeals from their families, arguing that their only crime was screaming, their sentences were reduced to 30 years of hard labor. Hartgen also tried to escape execution. His wife pleaded for mercy, citing their 3 young children, while a former mayor of Rüsselsheim vouched for his character. His supervisor at the Opel factory even described him as a hard-working and independent foreman. None of these pleas made a difference.
On November 10, 1945, 41-year-old Josef Hartgen and 4 others were hanged at Bruxelles prison. The executioner was U.S. Army Sergeant John C. Woods, known for his unorthodox methods. His executions were infamous because he deliberately miscalculated the drop, causing the condemned to strangle slowly instead of dying instantly from a broken neck. Some of the Nazi war criminals he executed suffered for several agonizing minutes before dying. Although Hartgen was seen kissing a cross before his execution, his actions a year earlier left no room for sympathy. When a bystander had tried to stop the beatings in Rüsselsheim, Hartgen had turned to him and warned, "Be quiet, or the same thing will happen to you." In the end, there were no tears shed for Josef Hartgen.